This Honourable House now resume its sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Whittle, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Campbell, Mrs. Malahoo Ford, Mr. Green, Mr. Terrelong, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Brown, Mrs. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Dayton Campbell, Mr. Pernell Charles Jr., Mr. Clark, Mr. Heroy Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Miss Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Miss Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hylton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Miss Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Vaz, Mrs. Vaz, pardon me, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright.
Statements, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that you call on the Minister of Local Government and Community Development, the member from West Kingston, to make a statement to the House.
Minister Mackenzie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my statement to this House last week, I spoke about the alarming rate of non-compliance with COVID-19 protocols at our beaches and rivers. In appealing for improved level of personal responsibility, I stated that the Social Development Commission would observe and measure whether our beach and river goers were obeying the reopening rules. You will recall at the press conference on Monday, it was noted that I would give further details today. Some 67 beaches and 74 rivers were visited last weekend. I regret to advise this Honorable House that the overall level of compliance was a mere 33%, with a clear majority of 67% of persons failing to observe the rules that were established. The breaches of the individual protocols, Mr. Speaker, were even more serious, where some 97% of people visiting the beaches and rivers last weekend did so without wearing any mask as required under the protocol. Some 66% did not practice social distancing, and many operators of these facilities also fail to obey and enforce the protocols. Only 22% of the river operators work within the designated hours as prescribed under the order. 46% of beach operators were compliant in this respect. 19% of beaches and rivers had sanitation stations, and 42% had clearly marked areas for vending. Only a meager 4% had signs erected stating the protocols to be followed. Parties and other events were still being held. A football tournament, Mr. Speaker, with over 800 people was held at Elshire Beach last weekend. Over 800. Football tournament sponsored by some major companies who should know better. This situation is untenable. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, as of tomorrow, the 2nd of July, all beaches and rivers will be strictly monitored, and those found to be in breach of the protocol will be closed with immediate effect, commencing tomorrow. Both beach and river operators, as well as the public, will be warned for possible prosecution under the Disaster Risk Management Act. The onus will be on the beaches and rivers and the operators of these facilities to satisfy the authority that they have put in place all the protocols before they are allowed to reopen, Mr. Speaker. So what is going to happen as of tomorrow? The monitoring which will be done will include the police, and where we observe that the protocols that have been handed out is not being followed, all of these establishments will be closed, and the possibility of prosecution against persons in violation could take place. The Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management and the Social Development Commission will be surveying the beaches and rivers to ensure that the protocols are being observed. The SDC's capacity will be boosted by the employment of some 250 temporary workers across the island to assist in ensuring that the compliance and the messaging is sent out, Mr. Speaker. This team will sensitize the operators and other persons about the importance of enforcing the protocols. Beach and river surveys will continue, Mr. Speaker. It is vital that all who operate and visit these facilities obey the COVID-19 protocols. I say once again, the manner in which people use these recreational spaces will determine whether they remain open or closed. Mr. Speaker, we talk about how much we value the work of the persons in public health. And if we don't ensure that we practice these protocols that is laid down by the Ministry of Health, then we are only going to put ourselves in more problems and create additional burden on our health workers who have been doing a good job over this period. Mr. Speaker, cinemas, playhouses and theaters have been closed since March. These venues will be conditionally reopened for 14 days with effect as of Sunday, the 5th of July. So on Sunday, the 5th of July, for a period of 14 days, cinemas, playhouses and theaters will be open to the public. Mr. Speaker, following intense discussions with the operators of these venues, the protocol will be set out in the order, Mr. Speaker. I won't spend much time, but one aspect of the protocol requires that not more than 60% of the seating capacity must be used, and there are other important mechanisms that have been put in place, which speaks to a maximum of 4 persons from the same family, and we have indicated that these requirements, Mr. Speaker, are necessary, and I want to thank the operators of these facilities who have met with us. I also want to mention, Mr. Speaker, that in addition to the playhouses, many other locations such as schools, auditoriums and community centers are used for this form of entertainment, Mr. Speaker. Let me make the point that only plays will be facilitated. We're not talking about parties. We're talking about plays. You know, there are some plays that is staged in the corporate area that is taken outside of the corporate area and are held in auditoriums and community centers. This is what we are talking about. And the same protocol will be in place as it relates to that. Mr. Speaker, restaurants. As of tomorrow, the 2nd of July, dining will once again be allowed in restaurants. Occupancy, Mr. Speaker, must not exceed 50% of the capacity at any one point in time. No more than 4 persons can be seated at a table. There must be at least 6 feet of space between the table. And we are asking, Mr. Speaker, in the protocol that no table must be joined to facilitate large groups, Mr. Speaker. The operators of theaters, cinemas and playhouses and restaurants must allow access to officials from the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development the Jamaica Constabulary Force, and the Ministry of Health to monitor these operations, Mr. Speaker, and all persons will have proper identification. There are other protocols and information that will be shared with all stakeholders. Consultation and partnership remain critical to our effort at normalization, and some of these measures, Mr. Speaker, emerge from discussion with the private sector organization of Jamaica, and I want to express the gratitude of the government to the President, Mr. Keith Duncan, and the PSOJ for the support that they have given in the reopening of the Jamaican economy, and I want again to use this opportunity to commend them. Mr. Speaker, the issue of entertainment has been a major area of concern. The Most Honorable Prime Minister indicated that discussions will commence to look at the reopening of the entertainment sector. I am pleased to announce that tomorrow, the 5th of July, tomorrow, the 2nd, a meeting with the entertainers, with the Ministry of Entertainment, to discuss the way forward will be held at the Ministry of Local Government. This meeting is being convened so that we can have the kind of discussion that will inform whatever recommendations will be made at the subcommittee of Cabinet on Friday. Mr. Speaker, we have extended an invitation to a wide cross-section of the entertainment industry, and Minister the Honourable Babsy Grange have been working to ensure that all the major players are involved in the discussion, and we will take on board their recommendations as it relates to this vital industry. But I want to make the point to members of this Honourable House. Any decision that is taken on the reopening of any entity that was closed must have the blessings of the Ministry of Health. Without the Ministry of Health sanctioning any decisions, no decisions can be made, and I want to make that point. The Honourable Prime Minister announced on Monday that the operating hours for our markets will be extended by an additional 1 hour. So markets will now be open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. This time extension also applies to vending in public arcades and the operations of public transportation centers. Markets will continue to be closed on Sundays to allow the local authorities to clean and sanitize these locations. Mr. Speaker, the government remains concerned that many people are not respecting the gathering and distancing protocols at funerals and burials. Large crowds and close contacts at these events have already led to areas being quarantined to contain the resulting spread of COVID-19. I'm appealing again for full compliance with the protocols surrounding funerals. No more than 50 mourners at a funeral, depending on the square footage of the church, and no more than 15 persons at the burial, of which only 10 can be mourners. And I want to again emphasize that these measures, the enforcement is taking place, but it seems as if we're going to have to step up the enforcement, and that is not something that we really want to do. We are asking persons to respect the protocols in paying respects to those who have passed. I am urging, Mr. Speaker, and seeking the support of all Jamaicans as the government moves to open business and to relax some of the measures, that we try our best and ensure that these measures work. I am asking for everyone to accept that these are not normal times. Do not risk your health or your life and the lives of your family and friends by breaking these rules. The rules are there to protect each and every one of us. I am asking for public observance of all the COVID-19 protocols as the government balance business, resume social life with the preservation of public health as the #1 priority. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, Minister, must say that the opposition joins with the government with regards to asking for the public to ensure that they adhere to whatever protocols are put in place when the venues or events or whatever the case may be are reopened. Speaking of beach and rivers first, Minister, I remember initially when the announcement was made, and I raised the question then with regards to the capacity we had to do the monitoring. Because at that point in time, based on the society that we're living in Jamaica, we would have anticipated that we're going to have some of these issues that we have now highlighted with regards to the lack of compliance when we leave certain things to self-responsibility. And we had asked then, what is the capacity? At the time, I was asking what is the organization that was responsible. I was told the SDC at the time, and I was asking what is the capacity of the SDC to deal with it. I am seeing now where we have highlighted that we're going to hire temporary workers to boost the staff of the SDC, along with the Office of Disaster Preparedness, to deal with the monitoring of these particular venues. Because as I stated then, we know that we would have had these difficulties, and we would have hoped that from the onset, where we would have opened these venues, we would have put all these things in place to ensure we're not where we are today. So we're happy that the necessary steps are now being put in place to ensure that the capacity is there for these organizations. I'm not sure if we have done that study to try to find out how many persons are going to need to cover what area. You'll have to give us that information. But based on the number of temporary workers, we would hope that that will be enough. A direct question I would have with that though, you mentioned also that if they don't follow the protocols, people will be penalized. And I think probably what can be put out there is for persons to know the penalties that will be associated with non-compliance. So I'm asking you, Minister, to let us know what will be these penalties that persons will face if they don't comply with the regulations that are put in place. With regards to the cinema and playhouses to be reopened, I also want to know, for other events, because we mentioned entertainment. And there are entertainment events also that you have seated events apart from movies and plays. For example, if you want to watch a live band, just give you one example. So there are many other events that are listed under entertainment that don't really necessarily be a party. So we want to know if the same protocols, we know we're going to have the meeting tomorrow, but we want to look at if the same protocols that can be used to open the cinema and the playhouse, for example, it's a 60% seating based on the capacity. We want to know what protocols, if the same protocols can be used for other entertainment events that will be there. And when we mention entertainment again, the main disappointment I would have, because you just mentioned a while ago how vital the industry is, you actually use that word. And the main disappointment I have is how long we have taken to actually begin the discussion. Because we're going to start the discussions tomorrow, and we're happy for that. But it is something I've been lobbying for also, because a lot of persons benefit directly from the entertainment industry, mostly the informal sector. So many persons benefit from entertainment events. And these persons have been calling out over the weeks and finding out what is happening to them, because nobody seemed at the time to be concerned about their particular well-being. So that is what main disappointment really, entertainment sector. But there are many suggestions that have come to the fore. We're happy that the meeting is being held tomorrow. We don't know how many suggestions will be taken. But what we're asking for is that for the same protocols that are put in place for other places to have gatherings, we can look at these same protocols to take place in the entertainment industry. And one last question, Minister, read the funeral thing you just mentioned. I just want to be clear, because the statement with regards to saying no more than 50 and then saying depending on the square footage, it can be confusing. So I want to be clear, because some churches, for example, the huge ones, let us not then use a particular number. Just like how we were flexible in saying that the supermarkets, for example, must look at the square footage they have, and then they can know how many persons can hold comfortably based on the social distancing. I think the same thing is 60%. So for example, large churches, instead of saying 50 persons in a church, use that same protocol with regards to the size of the church and the amount of persons that can hold based on distancing to decide how many people. Because when I say 50, people just run away with it and say only 50 people can be in there. When based on the statement here, I think you're saying, depending on the size, that some churches can have more than 50. And if that's not what you're saying, I am suggesting that we work it that way, where we don't stipulate that 50 persons can be in the church, but stipulate and say, based on the square footage that each area has, we determine how many people must be in there. And then the persons who are monitoring now, they are the ones now who should go out there and ensure that the restrictions are being adhered to. So those are the questions. And one more thing, Minister, political meetings also would fall under gatherings. And they also fall under events. So what we're asking, if the same protocols that are used now to determine these gatherings of the 60%, of not using the venue capacity of more than 60%, if this goes also for political meetings. I'm not talking about only MPs and councillors who are exempt, or other political meetings are held outside of that. Those want to know what is the protocol that is going to be put in place for those different things. Me? Well, I need to invite you to some of those events. Thank you.
Some order, please.
Mr. Speaker, you're going to ask something, Ronnie?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I just wanted to be absolutely clear that the rule for churches would be similar to that for the cinemas, playhouses, and theatres, where you have, for example, an instance Minister well knows, Holy Trinity Cathedral can seat 1,100 people. To put 50 there is a constraint. If we may put 60% of the accommodation, bearing in mind the spatial, would that be allowed?
And this is why we said 50 or more based on the square footage, because you don't want to say XY and you get more than 50 persons in a space that cannot facilitate 50 persons. And that is why we have added the square footage, member, so that if your capacity, once the social distancing can be observed, then that is fine. So we have to put a number. We couldn't leave it as an open book, because you would be quoting disaster. Now the question of political meetings. The gathering has been increased to 20. So we would we have not discussed that as yet. We have not discussed that as yet. We have not discussed that as yet. What we have looked at, and in response to the members' concern about the entertainment, I want to make the point that the kind of entertainment I think you're referring to are the nightclubs and the parties and the round-robin events that draws massive crowds, that requires real consideration. Remember, we are gradually reopening, so we don't want to take everything at the same time. You must remember, as I said earlier on, we have to take into consideration the public health aspect of it, and whatever protocols are going to govern the operation of nightclubs and that kind of entertainment that you are alluding to has to have the full consent of the Ministry of Health. So the meeting tomorrow, and it is not fair to say that we weren't paying attention. Discussions have been taking place, and I can say that a proposal was made at a special meeting where we looked at some of what was put on the table. But this is a continuation of those meetings, that we are extending those meetings to see whether or not we can arrive at a position. And I know the importance of that business. My constituency and my neighbor up in the south, a lot of our people rely on the round robin and the various breakfasts and afternoon party. It is generally accepted. But it also comes with a great public health risk that has to be taken into consideration, and that is being done. You spoke about the control measures and whether or not we were equipped. It is because of what we had put in place why we were able to present the kind of figures and information based on what was out there. So in terms of the numbers of persons, this weekend we saw more persons turning up. Yeah, more than we can count. And it is understandable. So we are now strengthening the capacity to respond. And you spoke about fines. Under the disaster risk act that we are now operating, persons that are found to be in violation of the act can be fined up to $1 million and serve 12 months in prison. I am hoping that we will never have to reach that stage to enforce the protocols, because these protocols have been made in the interests of the people themselves, to protect them and their livelihood. And all that we are asking is for full cooperation to try and make the protocol work. Okay? And basically, those are the answers. Were there any other questions at you?
Minister, two sets of questions. I think by your own acknowledgement, the disparity between what can happen in a cinema and what can happen in a church or even a political meeting don't make logical sense. So I'd ask you to revisit that to ensure there's some equity and balance in terms of the different types of activities that can take place. I want to ask you about summer school and summer camp type activities. As a member of Parliament, and I'm sure many colleagues in here are used to hosting these kind of activities. The students have been out of school from March. Many of them are eager to have some kind of interaction. What is the government's policy on those types of activities? Some of them would involve residential, some would involve sporting type activities for the youngsters. Is there a position? Because I have a CDF allocation that I haven't determined how I will use as yet, because I'm not clear what the government guidelines are with respect to
that. I would take the rest of the questions.
Mr. Speaker. Minister, I see in the statement that you will be having a meeting this week to finalize some of the finer details. The challenge I have, though, on page 4 of your statement is that promoters or managers must ensure that all actors are screened and required tested for COVID-19. Against the background of some of the challenges we have with the Ministry of Health and testing of persons, where there is not even right now if you want to do a test, there is readily available a test. Can you ensure that in the discussions that you have this week, where this particular matter is concerned, that you explore and find what the exact arrangements are, so that it can be broadened and given to the public as to how this will be effected?
Mr. Speaker, Minister, you mentioned the fact that many of these public spaces, the beaches and the rivers, which are not, some of them are not monitored or not managed by anyone specifically. For example, in South Manchester, we have the Guts River, which is a public area. Nobody is in charge, so to speak. How would you ensure that the protocols are observed there? Who would be responsible or who would be held responsible as it relates to those areas here?
While we are aware there are unregulated rivers and such across the country, we do have a list within the SDC of all these locations. So periodic monitoring will be undertaken, but again, we would have to rely on the community effort of like members of Parliament and councillors to assist in sending the messages in some of these areas which are not so populated and which are unregulated. So, you know, we just have to work within the limitation of what we have. But the messaging is going to be important, and we are going to be doing a lot of public education around the new protocols that we have announced, so that we can continue to sensitize people about the importance of sticking with the protocols. So I hope that answers your question. In regards to the member from Central St. Mary, the question of this, we thought, based on discussions with those players, and because the kind of theatering that we're talking about is where they would stay on stage and would be speaking, so you know the saliva will fly. And that is why in the protocol we had recommended that the first 2 rows be free, so that that sort of close contact. And this is something that we have discussed, and we'll have further discussions to see how we can make it work. Because, members, if we look at what is happening worldwide, a lot of countries have opened up and are now paying a dear price because the thing has just now taken a new life. And we don't want to in this country, because we know the state of our health system and we know how pressured our health workers are. So it is in our best interest to ensure that all of the protocols that we can possibly put in as safeguard measures, that we get them into the system. Okay?
Minister, if you yield a little, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying. The point I was making was that you have to ensure that from the Ministry of Health perspective, that the arrangements are made for those who want to be tested in line with this protocol that you have made is made easier.
And that is a part of the discussions with the Ministry of Health. They have been a part of it. Remember, in response to the query from Southeast in regards to summer schools, it was just 2 days ago I had a meeting with my summer camps and program. I had a meeting with my own constituency to look at how we are going to approach the summer program. It's not a matter that we have looked at in any detail, but I can assure you that I will place it on the agenda of the Cabinet Subcommittee for Friday, and next week I will be probably able to say something about how we are going to treat the summer program right across the country.
We discuss it afterwards. Bills brought from the Senate, petitions, papers, reports from committees. Notices of motion given orally. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, on the order paper, number 60, there is item number 9. There is a motion that I entered on the 29th of May, 2018. That is more than 2 years ago. It's in respect of a revised prayer for Parliament. We haven't had the time to deal with it in the normal fashion. I understand that the Standing Orders Committee is now functional or about to be functional. And I have raised the question with the House Leader, who I think will agree that with the permission of the House and of course yours, we could simply lift this motion and refer it to that committee for its consideration. Would you agree?
Is that?
And so I move, sir, that the motion in my name be referred to the Standing Order. That the motion number 60 on page 14 of the order paper in relation to a parliamentary prayer be referred to the Standing Orders Committee of Parliament for their consideration and early report.
Mr. Chair, that item should come under public business.
Oh, well, since it's notice of motion given, all right.
We accommodate it.
All right.
Notices of motion given orally.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be Be it resolved with reference to the motion moved in this Honourable House on the 12th day of May 2020, appointing the Integrity Commission Oversight Committee of the House of Representatives, that the name Maurice Guy be deleted and the name Peter Bunting be substituted therefore. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at a later stage today I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Questions and answers to questions.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Voting.
on behalf of the member for Western Westmoreland, I'd like to say that in 21 days he will ask the following question to the Minister of Economic Growth and Job Creation.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Economic Growth and Job Creation, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Limited Liability Companies Act 2020.
A bill shortly entitled the Limited Liability Companies Act 2020 read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favour? Those against? Yes, have it. Go ahead, Mr.
I move that the motion be approved.
Mr. Traits.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, you didn't put a motion.
Mr. Speaker, the matter for which I moved has not yet been, the question has not yet been put.
Those in favour?
Yeah.
Those against? Yes, have it. Go ahead, Mr.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the private member's motion number 60 be referred to the Standing Orders Committee for their deliberation and report.
Those in favour? Those against? Yes, have it.
Mr. Speaker, it had been intended at this time to receive the presentation by the Ministry of Health in the sectoral debate. However, he is not here at the moment, so I'm going to ask you to invite the Minister of without portfolio in Agriculture to make his presentation.
Minister Hutchinson.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking permission to speak from a seat other than my own.
Go ahead, Mr. Hutchinson.
Yes. No, it's all right. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased this afternoon to address this honorable House on one of the most important topics that we have as far as the economy is concerned, and that is agriculture. Mr. Speaker, I wish to immediately reiterate my own commitment, as well as the commitment of the government, to sustainably transform and expand the agricultural sector. Mr. Speaker, our goal of increased and sustainable production and food security must continue to be our unwavering focus, for as the COVID-19 pandemic has forcibly reminded us, it is agriculture that is the main cornerstone of our lives, our livelihoods, and our economy. So in my presentation today, Mr. Speaker, I will identify and outline some critical aspects of the Ministry's roadmap towards sustainable agriculture production and food security. But, Mr. Speaker, before I proceed to outline that roadmap, allow me first of all to acknowledge those who have made it possible for me to be here. The Most Honorable Prime Minister, my cabinet colleagues, parliamentarians, and the constituents of Northwest St. Elizabeth, part of the Food Basket Parish of Jamaica. I thank them for the support they have provided me on this journey. Let me acknowledge and thank also members of my staff and support team at the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries. One of them who has worked very hard since coming in, the Minister of State, and my colleague from that wonderful parish, Minister Floyd Green. I must say we also have been working as a team led by Minister of Industry, Commerce and Agriculture, Minister Honorable Audley Shaw. Mr. Speaker, I want to make special mention of the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry. Since coming in, he has been doing yeoman work to make sure that agriculture is on the right footing. And I want to commend him on the work that he has been doing there. And last, but by no means least, Mr. Speaker, I salute the over 250,000 farmers of Jamaica, those registered and unregistered, and the other critical stakeholders in the agricultural sector in Jamaica for their committed and unwavering support of the industry. Mr. Speaker, as we journey along the road to an improved agricultural sector, we recognize that there are systemic challenges that confront the sector. We have identified these challenges over the years and have sought to address them, but we are aware that these are perennial challenges which require persistent and consistent attention. Our task, Mr. Speaker, is therefore to find and implement sustainable solutions to those problems. Our roadmap seeks to identify those problems and to outline the strategies and actions to resolve those issues. I believe many of the challenges that confront us in the sector are familiar to us, Mr. Speaker. They include matters of inadequate marketing and distribution of agricultural produce, climate and irrigation-related issues, insufficient investment, poor infrastructure like farm roads, land management and distribution, and major deterrents such as predial larceny. Let us begin with predial larceny, Mr. Speaker. The crime of predial larceny continues to be one of the major deterrents to agricultural production in Jamaica. It is estimated that this crime costs farmers some $6 billion annually, and perhaps equally, if not even more painfully, is the fact that the predial thieves are like scarecrows who drive away potential investors from getting into crop and livestock production, and so expanding a segment of the economy that is so critical to domestic supply and the export market. The crime of predial larceny is not an easy one to fight, but the ministry, working with our industrial partners, the judiciary and the constabulary force, is determined to confront and arrest this monster. Mr. Speaker, in this regard, the predial larceny control program of the ministry has been overhauled to bring it in line with the increased imperative for good production and food security. This means that the management process for predial larceny control is now being scaled up to include team leadership at the level of an assistant commissioner of police, with ASP Bishop Dr. Gary Welch currently at the helm. Establishment of police farmers groups on the same basis as the police youth clubs, where the PMOs and JS groups will work alongside with the police. With this, you will find that the farmers will have more confidence in relating to whatever they lose with the police. Acquisition of 7 brand new vehicles by the Jamaica Constabulary Force dedicated to predial larceny. Continued training, sensitization, and relationship building with police and farmers groups, corporate farms, and members of the judiciary. Establishment of a dedicated court day to deal with predial larceny matters. Re-establishment of the Agricultural Wardens Program, which is referred to in the Predial Larceny Act. Amendments to the Agricultural Produce Act, which I will detail later in my presentation. And stricter enforcement of the National Animal Identification and Traceability System called NATS. Mr. Speaker, the members of this Honorable House may recall the introduction of the National Animal Passport under the former late Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries, Roger Clark. The NATS was primarily intended for the control of disease, food safety, and the tagging and tracing of animals. The system also has the potential to curb predial larceny. At that time, Mr. Speaker, I remember when it was mentioned by this time about providing chips to go into animals. We were ridiculed, and I was even called chippy by some members over there. But we have found that the vision was there and it was right, and it has been taken up. It was taken up by the minister at that time. Let us recall, Mr. Speaker, that under NATS legislation, all cattle raised in Jamaica should have both the ear tags and the corresponding passport to identify the animal. So consequently, there should be no movement of cattle from any one location to the next without those passports and the ear tags. In addition, no public health inspector is permitted to inspect or certify any meat before an ante-mortem verification is done, which includes the checking of the passport and the matching of ear tags. Mr. Speaker, it's regrettable that there is no universal compliance with these requirements at this time. To date, of the estimated population of 76,000 cattle, approximately 50% or 38,000 have been tagged. Mr. Speaker, the time has also come for stricter enforcement of the animal identification and traceability system to ensure that the stamping and certification of meat from cattle are conducted in accordance with the law. This ante-mortem verification of the animal is an essential aspect of the breeder larceny control program. And so, Mr. Speaker, as we move to tighten the noose on the cattle thieves, I wish to take this opportunity to announce to this Honourable House and to the country that effective January 1, 2021, all cattle must have ear tags and corresponding passports. All cattle owners therefore now have 6 months to access the free ear tags and passport for each head of cattle, and we are urging them all to get those tags now. Tag your animals so we can trace them and keep them out of the hands of the pre-deal thieves. Mr. Speaker, over the coming weeks, the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries, through its veterinary service divisions, will be engaging the Ministry of Health and Wellness to collaborate with the Public Health Inspectorate in strengthening compliance with the regulations and to have adherence to jointly strengthen our resolve to ensure that no cattle meat is sold without requisite checks and balances in accordance with the requirements of the law. Mr. Speaker, our laws and regulations enable us legislators to enforce the necessary actions to realize our development goals. As it relates to the agricultural sector, we continue to review, amend and promulgate the enabling legislation. In this regard, I wish to heighten some of the legislation being pursued at this time. The Agricultural Produce Act is to be amended in order to strengthen and modernize the legislation for the purpose of effectively regulating the trade and movement of agricultural produce. Recommendations have been made and are now advanced for the submission to Cabinet. Among the changes being proposed in the new legislation are to expand the definition of agricultural produce to include fish, crops such as bamboo, castor bean, hemp, mushroom, and livestock. Increase in the fines of up to 3 million and the term of imprisonment of up to 1 year for pre-deal larceny. We see value in not only increasing fines and penalties, but also in adding a restitution clause so that farmers can recoup losses directly from the convicted criminals. Charges to the existing agricultural produce receipt to improve traceability systems. Inclusion of an invoice with the telephone numbers of the farmer and their taxpayer registration number. Invoices are to be used in consignment arrangement between farmers and purchasers of agricultural produce. Mr. Speaker, the issuing of invoices is an important and necessary step in safeguarding the farmer's income and to legally document those transactions in which the farmer has provided his or her goods on credit. Mr. Speaker, we are strengthening the legislative framework. We are giving the laws more and sharper teeth so that our farmers can reap far more of what they sow and can benefit from the livestock that they raise. Mr. Speaker, the Act, which is the Agricultural Investment Corporation Act, is being amended so as to transfer the rights, assets, and liabilities of the Agricultural Support Services and Productive Projects Fund Limited to the Agro Investment Corporation, AIC, and the winding up of the Agricultural Support Services and the Protective Projects Fund Limited. It also repeals the Agricultural Marketing Corporation Act of 1963 and the transfer of its titles and assets to the AIC. Mr. Speaker, the Plants and Plant Products Inspection and Quarantine Bill proposes new provisions for plant quarantine and produce inspection activity and to establish a department of government to be known as the Plant Quarantine and Produce Inspection Branch. The bill proposes measures to prohibit the entry of plant pests, prescribe measures to ensure the importation of only the highest quality pest-free plants, plant products, and other regulated articles, repeal the Plants Quarantine Act. Mr. Speaker, the JACRA Act is to be amended. The JACRA Act is currently under review and consultation is being carried out in order to merge the Banana Board with the authority. The amendment of the JACRA Act will also seek to address recommendations made by the stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, from all indications, the COVID-19 pandemic will continue to be with us for a while. We have to continue to manage it to ensure the highest possible levels of health, food, and economic security for the population. It is an unprecedented balancing act, but as government, it is our responsibility and duty to continue to provide the stellar leadership being provided so far in managing this disease. And I would like to congratulate, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health and Wellness for their vision in the management of this COVID-19. As it relates to the agricultural sector, I believe we have been stepping up to the plate, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, I wish to join in commending our farmers, our purveyors and distributors, the relevant agencies and all who have joined in the national effort to keep the nation fed, even while providing supplies to the export market. Mr. Speaker, in recognition and commendation of the hard work of our farmers, it is worth repeating that in a season when the overall economy declined by 1.7%, the agricultural sector grew by 7.8% in the January to March period, with a particularly strong performance of 10.7% growth in the domestic crops subsector. Mr. Speaker, with the drought and COVID-19 challenges, while we are pushing the farmers to get back into production, we are expecting a slight decline of some 3 to 5% for the April to June period. Notwithstanding, we are expecting an increase in the production of certain tubers and fruits. Mr. Speaker, I wish today, on behalf of the farmers of Jamaica, to acknowledge with thanks the $1 billion support for COVID-19 recovery program being provided by this government through the Ministry of Finance. This is the largest allocation given to agriculture for any single event by any government. This indicates the importance this government is now placing agriculture and in the forefront, and I would like to thank the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance for now putting agriculture in the forefront. Mr. Speaker, as part of the COVID-19 response programs and in accordance with MICA's business plan for 2021, I wish to draw the attention of this Honourable House to some of the strategic projects to be undertaken going forward. Among the areas to be funded under COVID-19, the recovery program is the provision of equipment and machinery. The provision of equipment and machinery valued at $230 million to include the procurement and use of drones to enhance the technological modernization of the agricultural sector and facilitate increased production and productivity. In addition to access to more tractors, bulldozers, and backhoes, I wish to emphasize the urgent necessity to utilize more drone technology in the Jamaican agriculture. This use of technology to assist extension officers and investors in the determination of physical characteristics of soil and ground cover is critical. To this end, the Ministry will purchase 13 drones for use by the extension officers. There is a need for greater infusion of technology in the sector to determine crop production, acres, livestock production numbers, soil fertility, assist breeder larceny, and environmental and crop forecasting. This is a priority. Mr. Speaker, priority focus also continues to be placed on the production incentive program aimed at boosting the capacity of our small farmers to achieve greater productivity. Under the production incentive program, it is projected that farmers will be provided with support for soil analysis, soil nutrition management, marketing, land preparation, seeds, planting material, fertilizer, all valued in excess of $350 million. As a special allocation under this program, the Ministry will be providing $50 million, $35 million of which is to be dispersed to all members of Parliament through specified program support to farmers, and $15 million to be further dispersed through RADA to registered, recognized farmers groups. You mean not even a clap? I'm going to take it. Mr. Speaker, the heat is on and the drought has started to impact farmers in some of our most productive areas, such as those in Clarendon, Manchester, and St. Elizabeth. But already, Mr. Speaker, the water trucks are also rolling out under the $194 million drought mitigation program being implemented by the National Irrigation Commission. Some 275,000 gallons of irrigation water has already been trucked to 136 farmers in 22 communities. Procurement of 500 water tanks is in progress, and 2,000 quarter-acre drip irrigation kits are to be provided in short order. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the opposition spokesman on agriculture has said, that this government has reduced the area under irrigation, this government now has the largest irrigation projects that we have ever seen in years, funded under the United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Partnership Fund through the Caribbean Development Bank, valuing at over £50 million. Mr. Speaker, there is a $95 million support to poultry, pigs, small ruminants, farmers, and fisheries to equip them to receive market changes under COVID. Mr. Speaker, as we move to recover from the impact of COVID-19 and chart the course to sustainable agricultural production, it is even more important now to strengthen the present structure. From start to finish, from farm to table, we have to strengthen and expand the linkages along the agricultural value chain. In this regard, we must vigorously pursue strengthening the value chain management system. A critical item on the agricultural roadmap is the strengthening of this value chain to include hotels, exporters, consumers, agro-crop, and agro-processors. In this way, we can address issues of shortages and perception of a glut and of flexibility in our marketing system. Mr. Speaker, market access for agricultural output has been a perennial problem, particularly for small farmers in Jamaica. There is no glut, Mr. Speaker. The occurrence of COVID-19 exacerbated this issue and exposed the need for a more robust and resilient distribution system and diverse markets. Mr. Speaker, enhance farmers' access and to mitigate its effects of future shocks. Useful initiatives now being executed in association with the private sector to improve the agricultural distribution system therefore include the extension of the agri-linkages exchange system, which links farmers to the hotel and tourist sector, to other players such as supermarkets, expansion of the relationship between farmers and the school feeding program, investment in cold storage facilities in areas where major actors in agro-processing operate to allow for greater levels of storage, and the investment in refrigerated vehicles. Again, Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 experience has been instructive in highlighting the need for providing easier access for consumers to produce markets, whether in the form of farmers' markets, mobile markets, or online markets and delivery services. The overwhelming positive response to the innovative approaches of marketing and distribution of fresh produce in communities island-wide is a valuable takeaway from the COVID-19 response. This is the wave of the future, Mr. Speaker. It is all about facilitating the ease of conducting trade and business, and specifically marketing agricultural produce. Jamaica will not be left behind. Food marts will be established as distribution outlets closer to communities, facilitating consumers getting their agricultural produce with a stone's throw from their homes. Rather, will provide the logistics for the transportation. Mr. Speaker, about 30% of the annual production of crops is lost due to poor harvest handling and treatment practices. This threatens the food and nutrition security of the country, reduces the projected revenue for agricultural production and the food processing sector while reducing the earnings of our farmers. To address these post-harvest concerns, the ministry is therefore seeking more support for capacity building for players along the value chain and for the provision of additional physical infrastructure, training, and equipment. Mr. Speaker, agro-processing is important for several reasons, one of which is a reduction in post-harvest losses. Agro-processing has the potential to increase nutritional value, food security, shelf life, and reduce food spoilages and wastage. Processed foods also enjoy greater price stability on the world market and may therefore increase market opportunities for export and import substitution, contributing to income security, employment generation, enterprise development, diversification of rural economies, among others. The COVID-19 pandemic has further highlighted the deficiency in the agro-processing sector. And so in addition to the short-term responses, the construction and equipping of additional facilities in agro-processing are among the key initiatives for the medium term. I urge the private sector to grasp the opportunities available in this area and invest in agro-processing. The RADA-operated incubators are also to be fully equipped and activated to enable the processing of crops into juices and purees and other intermediary products for general distribution and use in the public institutions such as hospitals, prisons, as well as in the school feeding program. Mr. Speaker, the work of the Rural Agricultural Development Authority is critical to the transformation of Jamaica's agricultural sector. I wish at this point, Mr. Speaker, to outline a few of the programs in which the agency is integrally involved. During the 2019-20 fiscal year, special emphasis was placed on field establishment, crop care management, monitoring and evaluation of the program's 9 target crops. Sweet yam, a total of 50 hectares was established and treated with fungicide under a structured management program. Yellow yam, the program sought to establish this crop in non-traditional growing parishes such as St. Mary, Portland, St. Thomas, benefiting over 25 new farmers and establishing over 2 hectares. The MD2 pineapple, this program was geared towards incrementally increasing the acreage of the ND2 variety in order to satisfy consumer demands. To date, 350,000 suckers have been distributed and 7 hectares established. Onion, this program is geared towards producing 20% of the consumptive needs of the country. Accordingly, 300 hectares of onions were established under the Production Incentive Program, with the crop now ending with an estimated 2,300 tons, one of the best in several years. The performance, Mr. Speaker, will exceed our target of 20% of the consumptive needs. This performance was influenced by an increase in productivity, with average yields increasing by approximately 40%. Irish potato, although 1,000 hectares were targeted for production, due to challenges with adverse weather conditions in Irish potato growing areas, just less than 1,000 hectares were established. This led to a production of 15,700 tons, a reduction of 2.9% over 2018. Mr. Speaker, the opposition spokesman on agriculture in this presentation to this House stated we now have to be issuing import permits for Irish potato, and that this government's emphasis is imports rather than enabling our local farming communities. Mr. Speaker, we have been importing Irish potato for a number of years now, not just since we have become government. In fact, it was the Jamaica Labour Party government that initiated the Irish potato, onion, sweet potato, ginger, yam, and strawberry programs, and there is an ongoing program for all these crops, as has been mentioned. The opposition spokesman further said, Mr. Speaker, our checks have revealed that the extent of the change in the school feeding program is a redesign of the recipe for baked products to reduce the sugar content and a replacement of the sugary drinks with bottled water. No structured arrangement has been made, he continues, with farming communities to produce and supply nutritional labeled locally produced crops for the nutritional enrichment of our children. Mr. Speaker, this spokesperson is clearly not aware of what has been happening in this country in agriculture. His former spokesman is much more enlightened than he is. I think he needs to take a course named The Basic Awareness of Agriculture in Jamaica from someone in North Trelawney named Toba Hamilton. Might be able to give him more information. Mr. Speaker, the Jamaica Labour Party government is the one that has been championing the school feeding program, and we have placed special emphasis on the breakfast program. It is absurd and ridiculous when he is unaware that many schools are using local grown produce in their school feeding program. Even in his own constituency, where he has one of the best schools with school garden going and the products going into his school feeding program. It must be highlighted also that great emphasis is being placed on school gardens where the children can start learning at an early age the importance of agriculture. The school gardens are also being used in some areas as demonstration plots for farmers within the area. The produce from school gardens goes into the breakfast program. It was the Jamaica Labour Party government that conceptualized the breakfast program using locally grown produce. The late Roger Clark himself said, "We are the conceptualizer of the programs, and he is the implementer." I hope everybody remember that. But what Roger told me, I am part of the government here. He told me that I am the conceptualizer, but I conceptualize. And so what we find is that what is happening now is that most of those that were conceptualized have not been implemented as sustainable programs. It has therefore come back to us to not only be the conceptualizer, but now to be the implementer. Mr. Speaker, National Farm Road Rehabilitation Program. A total of 77 roads was completely rehabilitated for the 2019-20 period with an overall expenditure of $561 million. As we have heard, Mr. Speaker, as a result of the COVID-19, the budgetary allocation for the National Farm Roads Program for this year has been reduced to $525 million for the rehabilitation of 56 roads. Permit me on a local note, Mr. Speaker, to inform my constituents, and I do this because that is the only problem I have, that the main road from Ginger Hill to Pisgah in northwest St. Elizabeth has been tendered and we expect that a contractor will be selected soon to execute rehabilitation to this road and provide badly needed relief for the hard-working farmers of this area. Mr. Speaker, rather, as you can see, has a lot of demands, but the hands are few. Currently, one extension officer is called upon to serve 2,400 farmers. The agricultural aid program is targeting young people aged 18 to 35 from farming communities across the island, who will be trained by HART and extension officers to work within the farmers in those communities. Mr. Speaker, though delayed by COVID-19, funding is in place and the program has started with 90 trainees. They will work with the extension officers in the field for 1 year, after which they will be certified by HART Trust. Mr. Speaker, restructuring of RADA. Whether it is increased farming training, provision of extension services, creating the linkages between farmers and their markets, or assisting with the distribution program, the intervention of RADA is necessary. The challenge, however, is that currently we only have one extension officer to serve 2,400 farmers. A further detailed analysis of the staff composition, Mr. Speaker, reveals that 21% of the staff are located in the head office. 30% of the RADA staff are extension officers. Of the 520 staff members, 56% perform non-agricultural duties. 43% perform agricultural functions, with 34% serving as managers. What that means, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to restructure the organization in such a way as to put more boots on the ground. And so, Mr. Speaker, plans are on the way to increase the complement of the field staff so that more extension officers can be made available to work side by side with our farmers and farmers groups and create that paradigm shift that will boost agricultural production in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, the new structure will see an increase in our technical capacity by over 100%, moving from 150 to 303 assistant extension officers. What this means is that we will now have a ratio of one extension officer to 1,400 farmers within any net, with a net increase, with no net increase in cost. Over the next quarter, we'll be seeking Cabinet's approval for the restructuring of RADA. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated in my opening remarks, insufficient investment in the agricultural sector has been one of the major hurdles to the expansion of growth in this sector. Against that background, I join in saluting and welcoming the renewed interest of several large private sector investors in agriculture in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, chief among these agencies that we are looking to have involved is the Agro Investment Corporation, conceptualized, as its name suggests, as the investment arm of the Ministry of Agriculture and tasked with the promotion of agribusiness. The time has come for AIC to execute its core functions. Mr. Speaker, it's to redefine its role as an agricultural investment and development corporation, to de-emphasize its landlord functions and re-emphasize agricultural trade and promotion and investment, and to seriously undertake the monitoring and organization of a produce distribution and management network throughout Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, we have to be looking at the utilization of available sugarcane lands. Mr. Speaker, with the right sizing of the sugarcane industry, new opportunities are emerging for the diversification of agriculture in Jamaica.
Members' time for speaking has expired. House Leader.
I know.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member's time be extended sufficiently to enable him to complete his presentation.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, members. Mr. Speaker, as the saying goes, when one door is closed, another is opened. In this case, as one farm gate is closing, another is opening. The transition from sugarcane cultivation into other crops is taking place all across the island in former sugarcane-dependent communities. Mr. Speaker, some 65,000 acres managed by the SCJ holdings are being redirected into other crops. These lands will be utilized to cover the gamut of the food production needs of Jamaica, to include fruits, vegetables, tubers, medicinal plants, large and small ruminants, pigs and poultry, by small farmers who were once sugarcane workers. As the SCJ Holdings has continued to recover lands from failed privatization efforts, Long Pond in Trelawney has seen the reacquisition of some 10,600 acres of land now being leased for productive endeavors. Of that amount, some 1,619 hectares is being made available to small farmers in the area for cultivation. Over some 635 acres of the former cane lands is being used by Organic Growth Holdings Incorporated for the growing of medicinal hemp to be used in the production of CBD oils. Over at the Golden Grove in St. Thomas, some 8,300 acres are also being transitioned into the other agricultural production, and the small farmers are not being left out. Mr. Speaker, the Holland Agro-Economic Zone, this is the embryo in facilitating a roadmap to a sustainable agricultural production and food security development program for Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, in July 2019, the lands formerly leased to Tufton Estate was handed over to Holland Producers Limited from the Sugar Company of Jamaica Holdings. Small farmers were immediately assigned to begin cultivation on plots no more than 20 acres each, on 1,212 acres of the 2,400-acre property, on which they are currently engaged in production of a variety of crops such as papaya, melon, squash, zucchini, hot pepper, cantaloupe, etc. The produce is sold for export to the local markets and for processing. At least one farmer is earning up to $1.2 million a fortnight off 10 acres of land. There has been 91 tons of crop produced between March and June of this year on the property. Produce was also reaped and processed at the incubator at the Rada Parish Office in Santa Cruz and used in the school feeding program. Most of these fruits and vegetables will be taken from the property and sent to the incubator at Rada to be processed into puree, juices, and other value-added items. Holland and the Rada compound on which the incubator is located will be the hub where produce will be collected throughout St. Elizabeth and surrounding parishes and redistributed to other parts of the island as is now taking place since the onset of COVID-19. This is how we have taken off the excess produce in St. Elizabeth. Food marts established by entrepreneurs throughout the island will get produce from these hubs, thereby providing a distribution network for the produce which will assist in eliminating the perception of any glut in any area. It will also see the farmer getting a better price for his produce and the consumer getting a more reasonable price for their agricultural items. Farmers within the area of these food marts will be able to sell their produce directly to these food marts. The first food mart which was held at the La Covia Center was one where it was $100 per pound food mart, where all produce was sold for $100 per pound. A number of investors has indicated an interest in establishing a processing facility on the compound, and they are in the brink of signing a lease agreement. Mr. Speaker, we still have a number of parcels of government lands that are lying idle, and we are in dialogue with various organizations to have these lands occupied by small farmers. These lands are mainly in Manchester, Portland, and St. Mary. Mr. Speaker, the opposition spokesman has also stated that the government policies threaten small farmers and, by extension, rural livelihood. Mr. Speaker, we as a government are putting more small farmers on agricultural lands now more than ever before. Mr. Speaker, as I come to the close of my presentation today, I wish to share with this Honourable House a few of the recommendations of the COVID-19 Task Force on Agriculture. The task force urges us, Mr. Speaker, as we chart the way forward, to ensure that the sector continues to play a greater role in the economic development of the country. That is to be achieved, Mr. Speaker, through increased production, lower food imports, and increased linkages to manufacturing and tourism. The concepts are not new, but I believe the pandemic has served to reinforce the urgency with which we must address them. It has also highlighted the possibilities and opportunities we have for expanding both fresh produce and processed agricultural products for export. The recommendation of the task force calls us to take action by stimulating production and productivity through a target productivity program, implementing a drought mitigation and irrigation program, continuing the implementation of the land reform and land use program, identifying and increasing storage and distribution facilities, placing special focus on agro-processing and a national agribusiness strategy, diversifying markets, and utilizing modern technology to advance research, documentation, and management of agricultural systems. Mr. Speaker, the task force has not lost sight of the fact that it does take cash to care, and so it also recommends that consideration be given to waiving of duties on tools and equipment, agriculture implements, seeds and other input material, and irrigation systems, removing the GCT from eggs to encourage greater consumption, and temporarily granting duty concessions on refrigerated trucks to move produce across the island and to minimize crop spoilage. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic has not caused us to lose our way, but it has brought us to a juncture on the road to national development that requires significant stimulus for growth. Agriculture has a significant pivotal role to play in stimulating that new renewed growth. Mr. Speaker, this government has put agriculture on the pinnacle for development and to be the driver of growth in our economy. No mining nor tourism, etc., has been providing that elasticity for the expansion of the various sectors of the economy as agriculture has been doing recently. Mr. Speaker, this government has shown that this is a visionary government. We have shown that we are the conceptualizer of projects and programs to take Jamaica on a path of agricultural production and food security that is sustainable. As we embark on this journey, let us together engage our energies to bring about the growth and development of agriculture in our various constituencies so we can provide the path for the empowerment of our young Jamaicans. Together, through the hand of the Almighty, it will happen. God bless all members of this Parliament, and God bless all our farmers who are keeping our nation strong and healthy. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
House Leader.
You didn't hear. So how do you know?
Mr. Speaker, we have had a very enlightened presentation by the experienced Minister without portfolio in agriculture. I now ask that you invite to make his presentation or his contribution the member from Western St. Andrew, who is the opposition spokesman on logistics, industry and investments.
Mr. Hylton.
Member.
Mr. Speaker, I join my colleagues before me in commending you on your determination and at times courage in conducting the business of the lower house, which, as you know only too well, Mr. Speaker, can be quite a handful at times. You have stayed the course, and respect is due. Mr. Speaker, I give recognition to the following persons. Mr. Speaker, to the omnipresent, the omnipotent one, to protecting and guiding my footsteps. My family, Judith and Nile, for their support and understanding of the several family gatherings missed as I carry out my duties to my constituency, oftentimes at their expense, especially tonight, who has remained focused to achieve the Presidential Award for Academic Excellence 2 consecutive years at elementary level, and now moves on to middle school, Mr. Speaker. To the constituents of Western St. Andrew, and especially the leadership of the constituency, as we prepare to win one more for the people and to continue the important work. Mr. Speaker, a special shout out to the party leader, Dr. Peter Phillips, for showing courage. And when the chips were down, and the conviction that there will be a better tomorrow for the Jamaican people. I thank Dr. Phillips for his confidence in asking me to give content to a new portfolio which reflects his vision for a more competitive Jamaican economy at a time like this. To the staff in this House for always being supportive, and to my personal staff at the constituency office, including my driver and security, as well as the volunteers assisting with the upcoming campaign. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank them all for their support. Mr. Speaker, the councillors have been the wind beneath my wings, and I want to ensure that they understand that their efforts have been recognized. Mr. Speaker, the COVID pandemic has upended many things in our daily lives, and it has disrupted both lives and livelihoods. It has caused both supply and demand shocks to ripple throughout the global and local economies. Mr. Speaker, once reliable global supply chains are either strained or completely broken, and fragile local supply chains were rendered ineffective by the measures put in place by governments, including Jamaica, to slow the spread of the virus. Businesses from the length and breadth of Jamaica, and in every industry and sector you can think of, Mr. Speaker, have had their processes and models impacted by COVID-19. From the dressmaker to the rum distiller, from the farmer to the hotel operator, from the market vendor to the BPO operator, from the informal commercial operator to the large-scale food processors, all have felt the impact and the fallout from the pandemic. However, Mr. Speaker, the crisis has also shown us how resilient and resourceful the Jamaican people truly are. As a people, we know how to turn we hand and make fashion. The fancy, if not fully functional face mask has come to symbolize this spirit of enterprise and creativity. Mr. Speaker, the crisis has also presented us with the best opportunity in living memory to reset, restructure, and to rebuild a better Jamaican economy. Former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel is reported to have said, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." And Mr. Speaker, we ought not to waste this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, we cannot go back to the old normal or even business as usual. For far too many of our people, the old normal was not working. Normal was not equitable, inclusive, or just. Mr. Speaker, the Chinese word for crisis has two parts: danger and opportunity. Danger and opportunity. The government must, in this crisis, not only see the dangers, but must seize the opportunities and provide leadership. And if the government does not see the opportunities, Mr. Speaker, all they have to do is look to the people and the COVID-19 inspired solutions the people have either pioneered or adopted to solve the logistical problems of domestic food supply, for example. Mr. Speaker, the gig economy developed here in Jamaica has responded to the need for home delivery services and to bridge the gap between the agriculture-rich parishes and food-starved towns and cities throughout Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, we as a people most definitely know how to turn we hand and make fashion. Mr. Speaker, amidst the COVID-generated fear and concerns, as I look around and see the many delivery, e-commerce and teleservices that have cropped up to deliver anything from groceries to entertainment, to medical checkups. It is, Mr. Speaker, a representation of the resilience and entrepreneurial zeal of the Jamaican people. It is our people, seeing the disruptions to lockdowns, social distancing, and other measures required to contain the virus, and breathing life into opportunities by realizing the benefits of logistics and supply chain management that have been unmasked by the COVID pandemic. But what exactly is logistics and supply chain management? Mr. Speaker, as I've been explained elsewhere, logistics is a set of business principles, processes, and methods which facilitate the efficient delivery of goods, services, people, money, and data to the right place, at the right price, in the right condition, at the right time, in the right quantity, and to the right customer, both locally and globally. Supply chain management, Mr. Speaker, simply addresses the means, methods, and processes by which the product or service reaches its intended destination. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, the term global logistics and supply management speaks to efficiency and productivity, and in a single word, competitiveness. This current situation of supply chain disruption across industries and sectors, globally and locally, remind us, Mr. Speaker, that logistics is at the very heart of national and enterprise competitiveness. Some essential services sector that were never caught in the lockdown measures imposed by the government to slow the spread of the coronavirus have begun to point the way forward to opportunities in the reopening of the economy as we learn to balance lives and livelihood. The manufacturing and agricultural industries, Mr. Speaker, especially the food and nutraceutical subsectors, have proven this to us by their performance in the local economy and is starting to reveal itself in the export markets with an increase in exports to Jamaica $12.63 billion during the period January to May 2020 by Jamaica Manufacturers and Exporters Association members, which is a $74 million Jamaican dollar increase over the same period in 2019. Mr. Speaker, these are but a few ripples of success that with the right policy prescriptions can turn into raging torrents of successes, inuring to the benefit of the economy and increased employment. Mr. Speaker, logistics and supply chains are now words that seem to be on the tip of many tongues these days, and rightly so. However, Mr. Speaker, these are not just buzzwords, but as I have long said and very often, and it is now clearly being demonstrated and validated by our business people, that logistics is Jamaica's competitive advantage. Mr. Speaker, developing our logistics industry across all sectors is an additional means to make Jamaica's goods and services more competitive globally. While this proposition has long been articulated and formed the basis for the Logistics Hub initiative, which, Mr. Speaker, is a strategy to transform the whole of Jamaica into a value-added center for business and trade. The COVID-19 has laid this bare for all to see, not by any politician, but by our intrepid entrepreneurs. Mr. Speaker, our entrepreneurs have shown us the way forward during this crisis. They have shown us that logistic and supply chain management is not just a service industry in and of itself, but is important to all businesses as it greatly influences the cost of getting goods to market and ultimately reducing costs to end users and consumers. All business persons have shown just how fast logistics can grow in both scale and scope, and enable a business to expand into new markets and to add new revenue streams. Logistics, Mr. Speaker, more often than not, determines a business profitability and in competitive global markets, its survivability. Mr. Speaker, there is more than a correlation between an investor's decision to invest in a firm or a particular country location and the competitive position of the country or firm. More often than not, Mr. Speaker, it is the determining factor. Hence the reason, Mr. Speaker, policymakers, investors, and stakeholders pay so much attention to the rankings in the World Bank's reports on doing business and the Global Competitive Index of a particular country. Since 2016, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has not done well in these global rankings, as reflected in the slowing of the economic reform efforts under this administration. According to the latest UNCTAD World Investment Report, FDI investments in Jamaica are now down 14.1% year on year. Mr. Speaker, this is not a good picture, especially since the period covered the pre-COVID-19 period. Mr. Speaker, we already know that logistics is one of the key comparative advantages, given its geostrategic location in the Americas and next door to the Panama Canal. But what are some of the legislative, policy, institutional, and infrastructure supports put in place by successive administrations to exploit this comparative advantage? The network of highways are central to the effort to build a logistics ecosystem. And it is beyond cavil, Mr. Speaker, which administration either conceptualized, financed, or built the existing highway network, even if segments are named after other previous prime ministers. Mr. Speaker, the chief legislative, policy, and institutional supports to building Jamaica's logistics-centered economy are the Special Economic Zone Act and the Special Economic Zone Authority. SEZs are major policy instruments to improve national competitiveness and were put in place by the Portia Simpson-led administration. Mr. Speaker, I honestly do not think the Prime Minister, as the Minister of Economic Growth and Job Creation, has a full appreciation of the transformational power of SEZs and what they have done globally and what they can do in Jamaica if properly supported. Currently, our SEZs have a strong global services or GSS presence. Mr. Speaker, and the GSS global services sector, with its BPO subsector, should be greatly commended for weathering the COVID-19 storm and preserving much-needed jobs and significantly contributing to Jamaica's economy. The global services sector, along with tourism, are the two major services sectors in Jamaica. However, Mr. Prime Minister, the SEZ, properly understood, are not just about BPO. They are far more than that. The SEZs, Mr. Speaker, are a ready-made investment attraction tool positioned to take advantage of Jamaica's natural attributes, such as our location. They are oriented to build on our greatest asset, our people. The global services sector and their growing diversification from call centers to KPO, or knowledge process outsourcing, and ITO, or information technology outsourcing, are already taking advantage of these opportunities presented by the SEZs. Mr. Speaker, it is my strong opinion that Jamaica's clear competitive advantage in logistics and supply chain management has so far been under-promoted and underrepresented in the SEZs. The opposition is clear, Mr. Speaker, that to achieve the much-needed economic growth and job creation, it will be aggressively promoting, in addition to BPO, KPO, and ITO, a range of other industries in pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, including cannabis, petrochemicals, packaging, and bottling, among others. Mr. Speaker, I take this opportunity to commend the investors in Lidford Logistics, a manufacturing and agro-processing facility with logistics capabilities in warehousing, fulfillment, and distribution of baked products and agro-products, and much more. Mr. Speaker, the member from Northeast St. Anne has promised me a tour of this exciting facility, and I intend to take her up on her commitment well before the next elections, whenever that is called. But, Mr. Speaker, the constituency of Western St. Andrew will not be left behind in this effort to attract high-quality investments and to provide quality jobs for the inner-city residents in the Western Belt communities of Seaview Gardens, Riverton, Waterhouse, Olympic Gardens, Majestic Gardens, Drewsland, Duena Park, New Haven, Washington Gardens, and Ferry. The Seaview Eco-Industrial and Logistic Park, Mr. Speaker, is a U.S. multi-million-dollar investment by local and foreign investors in Hunts Bay, adjoining the port of Kingston. Mr. Speaker, pre-feasibility work has already begun, and much more will be said by the investors themselves in the coming months. Mr. Speaker, I must also mention the investment by Nestle, one of the largest global corporations in the global food supply chain, for developing its state-of-the-art logistics distribution center in Ferry Pen, West St. Andrew, and for being a responsive corporate citizen, providing training for the young logistics workers from the constituency, thus ensuring for them a bright future. And, Mr. Speaker, I cannot leave out Zuki Trucking, Jamaica's largest transport logistics firm, for relocating its headquarters in Western St. Andrew and Seaview Gardens, to be exact. So, Mr. Speaker, we in Western St. Andrew are not only talking logistics, we too are doing logistics. Mr. Speaker, one of the prerequisites for Jamaica realizing its full potential as a logistics gateway to the Americas is through a network of trade agreements ensuring market access and low or no tariffs for the goods and services produced in Jamaica. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's trade agenda must be much more ambitious than the current defensive posture of CARICOM on external trade. But, Mr. Speaker, there are some low-hanging fruits where some CARICOM countries, such as Trinidad and Tobago and Belize and Guyana as well, have sought and obtained waivers to enter full or partial scope trade agreements with other countries with whom Jamaica and other more defensive CARICOM countries did not want to expand trade with at the time. However, a condition of the grant of a waiver by the COTED, or the Council on Trade and Economic Development, is that every such agreement must contain a provision allowing all other CARICOM countries to join such agreements, either singly or collectively, subject, of course, to negotiation with the non-CARICOM country partner. Mr. Speaker, this suggested strategic approach allows quick movement in opening up trade lanes without enduring the interminable haggling and delays attendant on intra-CARICOM discussions on matters of trade. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica needs quick wins in its trade agenda in order to secure its comparative and competitive advantages as a logistics gateway to the Americas. In pursuit of this objective, Mr. Speaker, the first such agreement that Jamaica should seek to join is the existing partial scope agreement between Trinidad and Tobago and Panama, signed in October 2013. The next level of agreements to be signed in carrying out this strategy, Mr. Speaker, should be with those countries in Latin America, including Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, and others, all washed by the Caribbean Sea, and for which purpose the Association of Caribbean States was established. Negotiating bilateral or plurilateral trade agreements, Mr. Speaker, is currently the only option available to Jamaica and to CARICOM, where the multilateral trading system appears to be at a standstill, as signified by the announced early resignation of the current WTO Director General. Mr. Speaker, one of the sectors which has proven its resilience during the COVID-19 crisis and must be recognized as a sustainable growth and jobs-producing sector is the e-commerce sector, mentioned earlier. Global e-commerce, Mr. Speaker, involves cross-border movement of both goods and services and seems set to dominate the local logistics industry in any post-COVID discussion in relation to retail trade in particular, or the provision of warehousing, urban logistics, fulfillment and distribution centers. In light of the current and future economic role in driving job growth and investment, the question must be asked, what is the government's position on the WTO moratorium on electronic transmission?
Do they have one?
Mr. Speaker, the moratorium on imposing duties, tariffs, taxes, and other charges on internet transmissions occurred during the early days of WTO-sponsored negotiations between 1995 and 2000. Since then, tensions have developed and grown, mainly between the United States and EU countries, concerning measures or threats by EU countries to impose taxes on primarily US companies, such as Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, etc. The US, in turn, has threatened retaliation through trade measures should they proceed. Mr. Speaker, given the parlous state of our revenue coffers in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, if for no other reason, the government should be interested in this escalating debate. If the government has a position, it needs to be disclosed. And if it doesn't have one needs to be formulated quickly. For Mr. Speaker, we need to quickly wrap our heads around this issue, as it will impact Jamaica in the fourth industrial revolution and the recently announced plans by the Minister of Science, Energy and Technology to create a digital society and economy, as well as our planned global services sector expansion into KPO and ITO. Mr. Speaker, the Caribbean B2C e-commerce market, our business to consumer e-commerce market, is estimated to be valued at US $5 billion annually and growing at approximately 25% a year, of which Jamaica represents a significant portion. The opposition, therefore, implores the government to seek out the technical assistance of UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, to do an e-trade readiness assessment in order for Jamaica to have a fulsome assessment in identifying the gaps. This will enable the rapid development of data-driven policy response to support our entrepreneurs. The two major issues facing e-commerce in Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, are one, logistics infrastructure and connectivity. Here, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing some investments going into this area, with investments in ports, airports, and SEZs. The second issue, Mr. Speaker, is online payment. This is a real bugbear, Mr. Speaker, and needs to be tackled, or else it will stifle the growth of e-commerce in Jamaica, and by extension, the post-COVID economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, a robust e-commerce ecosystem is vital for growth, especially for MSMEs. And as such, the opposition has identified it as one of the driving forces in social and economic inclusion and empowerment for the mass of Jamaican businesses and people. Two areas, Mr. Speaker, that Jamaica can add to its competitiveness that are sadly often overlooked or put to the back burner and not given the prominence they should are quality standards and IP, or intellectual property. Both, Mr. Speaker, work seamlessly with logistics, especially now as we have moved into the fourth industrial revolution. Mr. Speaker, without quality standards, there is no competitiveness. Standards help to open export markets and transform market access into market presence and ultimately profitability. Commendation is due to the government, Mr. Speaker, and removal of Jamaica from the US watch list of countries it deems in compliance with international obligations to protect US innovators and creators of intellectual property from counterfeiters, pirates, and other violations of their IP rights. This was achieved, Mr. Speaker, after the Patents and Designs Act was passed earlier this year, thus completing a process that continued across administrations for well over a decade. Mr. Speaker, the other outstanding piece of major IP legislation is the Madrid Protocol, which is designed to give global protection to IP of World Intellectual Property Organization member states acceding to this treaty. Mr. Speaker, much work has already been done, and we await an update on this from the responsible ministry. Mr. Speaker, the impact of the pandemic.
Members' time for speaking has expired. House Leader, Acting House Leader, Minister Clark.
No, not at all. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the member's time be extended sufficient to allow him to finish his presentation.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Hylton.
I thank my colleagues for their indulgence. Thank you, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, the impact of the pandemic on the financial situation of local and global businesses cannot be understated, and the assistance programs put in place by the government, assuming it can be accessed by qualified firms on a timely basis, will still not be enough to prevent some firms from failing and going into receivership or declaring bankruptcy. Mr. Speaker, while not anticipating anything like the catastrophe created by the coronavirus on business viability, the Insolvency Act, passed in October 2014, does provide a framework for protection of insolvent companies and individuals, allowing them to work with creditors under the supervision of the Office of Supervisor of Insolvency to resolve their indebtedness and, if successful, to reorganize your business under the protection of the law. Mr. Speaker, the Act, as introduced, several innovations to assist the indebted to restructure their affairs in such a way as to preserve jobs, valuable goodwill and know-how, as well as other intellectual property, such as trademarks and copyrights belonging to the business. And I'm reminded by my colleague that a review of this legislation is now long overdue. The legislation, Mr. Speaker, has become important in times like this. But little has been heard from the organization or its parent ministry during this period. Mr. Speaker, it leaves one to wonder if all is well at the institution these days, and whether it is in a state which will allow it to discharge its functions as provided for under law in this most critical period. Mr. Speaker, competition law and policy share the same goal in advancing consumer welfare as our consumer protection laws. However, Mr. Speaker, the laws and policies are designed to function differently. While there may be overlaps at times between the two, competition law and policy focuses on the efficient operations of markets and the benefits to a wider consuming public. Consumer protection laws, Mr. Speaker, however, focus more on individuals or groups in the society who are vulnerable to the unlawful or undesirable conduct or practices of businesses in the marketplace impacting the consumer directly. The government, Mr. Speaker, has announced its intention to merge the operation of the Consumer Affairs Commission, the CAC, and the Fair Trading Commission, the FTC. Nothing more has been said publicly about this proposed arrangement, and despite my efforts to obtain the details of its proposals, the information has not been forthcoming. Mr. Speaker, it is of utmost importance that there be transparency in how these separate institutions are brought together given their related but different roles. Mr. Speaker, the critical role of competition was highlighted in the FTC versus Digital case, in which the Privy Council discussed the role of competition law and policy against that of a regulatory agency. There, Mr. Speaker, the court decided that notwithstanding the power of the minister under the Telecommunications Act to regulate the sector, this did not host jurisdiction of the Fair Competition Act and the Fair Trading Commission, where the conduct complained of had the effect of lessening competition in the marketplace. It is against this background, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition views the recent decision of the government to appoint the current chairman of the Fair Trading Commission as the incoming chairman of the Office of Utilities Regulation, OUR. Mr. Speaker, the opposition considers this decision a grave error, as there are inherent conflicts in the same person playing both roles. The opposition calls on the
point of information.
Mr. Speaker.
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. Is the help you? Point of order, sorry. Is the help? Is the help? You're raising a good point. And it's worth noting that the point of order, Mr. Speaker, is about what?
Mr. Green?
Point of order that I didn't want to use such strong words, but the chairman is no longer the chairman of the Fair Trading Commission.
Okay.
All right, so it's worth noting.
I'm glad to hear.
Yeah.
Not really, sir. That was not been said publicly. Not been said. Anyway. Well, Mr. Speaker, just for the record, I'm pleased to hear that the government has reconsidered that position because Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, that this this presents significant challenges in the operation of both the Fair Trading Commission and the utilities. All right? So I'm pleased to hear that. So, Mr. Speaker, that allows me to move on to my next area of presentation. Mr. Speaker, the acid test of the administration is not whether it made correct policy choices pre-COVID-19. Much of that is debatable, but how it responds to the real needs of the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises sector, which represents the greatest potential to drive growth in the economy, to sustain livelihood, and ultimately the social cohesion necessary for sustained development of our cities, towns, and rural communities. The task is made somewhat easier, Mr. Speaker, as the first MSME and entrepreneurial policy was adopted in the House on May 14, 2013, thus having the stamp of approval by both sides of the aisle. But what is the scorecard on implementation like, Mr. Speaker? And have we learned new lessons from the COVID-19 crisis to fortify our efforts at implementation? Mr. Speaker, because of the quality of consultation with the private sector and stakeholder communities conducted across administrations, the policy today serves as a comprehensive framework for the implementation of strategies to support the growth and development of the MSME sector. Mr. Speaker, because I was there at the adoption of the first policy and gave fulsome support to the amended policy, I can and must declare my own disappointment at the slow and uneven implementation of the MSME policy to date. Mr. Speaker, the failure at implementation, you don't want to start this one, you know. You need to listen to this one. Mr. Speaker, the failure at implementation of the policy has meant that with the partial lockdown due to the COVID-19 crisis, some 700,000 Jamaicans who earned the national minimum wage of $7,200 per week, or just above that, were left with no or reduced income for almost 3 months. Many of them, Mr. Speaker, work for small and medium-sized businesses in homes or were micro entrepreneurs themselves. Projections of a further 12 to 14% contraction in the economy and the recent showing of a negative growth in the last fiscal year by the Planning Institute likely takes into account continued unemployment projections and further negative impact on MSMEs. Mr. Speaker, the spectre of the leadership of the microfinance sector pleading with the government to have their voice heard on the Economic Recovery Task Force sent a clear message that once again only the big boys were invited to the party. The lesson of equity and inclusion still not heard, and if heard, not being responded to in a substantive way. Mr. Speaker, the results of the recent COVID-19 care grants are telling. The compassionate care grant for the individuals with its simple requirements of a TRN and access via remittance companies was oversubscribed. The small business grant and COVID-19 general grant for hairdressers, bartenders, barbers, taxi operators, etc., with its various requirements of licenses and bank accounts, was undersubscribed. Mr. Speaker, the available evidence has shown consistently that approximately 41% of the economy is informal, which means that most of them do not even deal with formal banks or pay taxes, except perhaps general consumption tax. The question arises as to what data sets did the government rely on in designing the relief for the small business operators? Could it have been done more effectively? This has served to further highlight, Mr. Speaker, the credit transmission problem, which has dogged the economy for quite some time, and speaks to the fact that funds made available to the MSME sector under various schemes are not getting to the sector due largely to the informality of the sector. Consequently, the flow of funds and the impact is limited. It means, Mr. Speaker, that different channels have to be found through which to flow the funds with the appropriate safeguards. One such suggestion, Mr. Speaker, is that these funds could be channeled through the microfinance institutions themselves because of the lower interest rate and lower infrastructure that they offer, and Social Development Commission officers assigned to communities island-wide with simple but verifiable eligibility criteria. A national identification system, Mr. Speaker, is a part of the solution. But until the right system is put in place, these suggested approaches should be examined. Mr. Speaker, the report on the recommendation of the task force on the reopening of the economy has been long in coming and would have been an appropriate context against which these debates should be taking place. I am again urging that the task force's recommendation be tabled in this House sooner rather than later. If the MSME sector is to play a central role in the rebuilding of the economy, Mr. Speaker, additional stimulus must be provided through a mix of policies, legislation, and fiscal measures. One additional source of funds to be used to stimulate the economy, Mr. Speaker, is the unclaimed funds in the banks and other financial institutions. The government has gone silent on this after promises that legislation will be brought to the House shortly to sequester these funds after a long period of dormancy in accounts activity, and with appropriate guarantees to protect these funds from being depleted by bank charges. Nothing more has been heard from the minister in charge. And if the member from St. Catherine South were here, he would join in asking what about his motion, his private member motion on bank charges. These are all allied issues. This potential pool of funds, Mr. Speaker, estimated to be in excess of $40 billion, is now necessary and urgent to provide a boost to the productive enterprises and to the MSME sector in particular, in the form of grants, zero or low interest loans, and government guarantees, etc. Mr. Speaker, the Security Interest in Personal Property Act, SIPA, of 2013 seeks to address the critical challenge of securing capital for businesses that are often overlooked by existing financial institutions owing to their lack of traditional collateral, such as land or houses. The SIP Act, Mr. Speaker, creates a new avenue of funding for entrepreneurs by making possible the acceptance of non-real estate assets or investments. These include the use of assets, movable assets, such as motor vehicles, agriculture products, livestock, stocks and securities, machinery and equipment, crops and other agricultural yields, accounts receivable, future crops, future acquisition of security interest, and unborn livestock. Owners of creative works, innovators and inventors, Mr. Speaker, can also leverage their intellectual property, such as copyright, patents, and trademarks, to be used as collateral in the process of securing loans. Mr. Speaker, it is critical, too, for the government to immediately operationalize the MSME set-aside policy. Mr. Finance Minister, the set-aside policy, it is urgent that the government move to operationalize the set-aside policy and activate the reserve portion of the government's annual procurement contracts for the MSMEs, and to ensure they are paid on time. Mr. Speaker, trade finance can help cash-strapped small businesses keep their export clients, and is particularly relevant to firms that are exporting to compensate for lower local demand. For example, Turkey's Export Credit Bank has extended its credit repayment period by 2 to 6 months and stretched its rediscount credit terms to 2 years. Export Development Canada, Mr. Speaker, recently announced it would offer exporting companies a guarantee on loans. These and other measures are urgently needed, Mr. Speaker, if we are to get the wheels of commerce turning again and help entrepreneurs to do what they do best, which is grow their businesses and create employment for those in our society who need it most. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I say, like the mythical phoenix, the Jamaican economy and her people have a great opportunity to rise from the ashes produced by the COVID-19 pandemic, to reset, restructure, and to rebuild a more just, equitable, inclusive, and, dare I say it, a prosperous society and economy that works for all and not just a few. We cannot miss this opportunity, Mr. Speaker. May God bless Jamaica, land we love. I thank you.
Mr. Speaker, another very well presented and thought out presentation from the member. Mr. Speaker is not intending to do any further business for today, so I invite you to adjourn this House until next Tuesday at the 7th at 2 p.m.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. This honorable House now stands adjourned.